Good morning. Thank you for coming out on this snowy day. My name is Judy Rosser, and some of you may know me. I have different hats. Um, Mr. Lynn, if you know Mr. Lynn from the pre-K Sunday School, I'm his wife. I'm Sarah Oliveri, the youth director's mom. And in this past year, I am now a grandma to Landon. So those are some of the hats I wear. But the one hat you may not be aware that I wear is in the community, which is I'm the director of Blair County Drug and Alcohol Programs. And in that role, our office is responsible for the funding that comes into our community to address this issue. So we're the central point of contact in our community. And today, there we go. What we are introducing to you today through the ministry here in our church is Pathways to Hope. And what Pathways to Hope is a faith partners ministry. And this is not a program, but it was a process that our church has been going through for the last year to prepare ourselves to have the capacity to address this issue. So you might remember, if you were here on the weekend, we did the surveys. We wanted to find out what was our faith community's thoughts on this issue and whether we should be engaged in processes to help address it. And through that survey, it was wholeheartedly seen that yes, our church felt the church has to be part of the response. How this came about was I had a member in the community from the faith community. He kind of pops around different areas of churches, and he came to me and said, you know, this addiction issue has to be a church solution. The churches need to unite to get together and to start addressing this in our community. And so I had had been exposed to this program, Faith Partners, at one of my national conferences I had gone to. So I went to pull it off the shelf, couldn't find it, of course, it had been a couple years. And but I Googled it real quick, it came right up, I called the phone number, and the guy who did the presentation answered the phone. God incident? I believe so. God wink? Absolutely. So we started, and we exposed, we have right now about 5 or 6 churches going through this process, and I am really excited that First United Methodist Church is part of that. So we believe addiction has a spiritual remedy. What I'm going to do right now is just give you a snapshot of the condition of this issue in our community. Most of this is Blair County information, but I'm also going to give you some state and national information. The idea here is to help you understand why the magnitude of this issue is so important for us to address, to maybe compel you, if this is something that God's put on your heart, that maybe to join us in this ministry. And then also, though, to let you know, we do a lot more will be coming in this next year to help educate our congregation on this issue by different presentations. Because a lot of this information, we do presentations on it, and they're at least can be anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour long, depending on what the subject is. All right, but if you'll participate with me this morning, you probably had a chance to read this. This is a true or false. Who thinks this statement here is true? Okay, about half of us. Okay. It is actually true. This is data from our Pennsylvania Youth Survey for Blair County. These are our Blair County youth answered these surveys. About 3,800, 4,000 surveys were done from 6th, 8th, 10th, and 12th. We've been doing this survey since early 2000, and we have every other year done this survey with our schools, and youth have responded to it. And you can see the largest jump and the most at-risk point of initiation is from the age of 12 to 15 for substance use. We have alcohol as top, and then marijuana very close behind in initiation of use of these 2 drugs. Then the other thing that was very startling that I felt I needed to put up here was the vaping issue that has come down. Youth are being exposed to messaging and marketing to target them. Look at the jump from 6th to 8th grade of kids indicating they have experimented with vaping. Even though it's just flavoring, what that does is it is promoting a culture of acceptance in this behavior. They are being targeted. This is not an anomaly for Blair County, though. This was also represented in the state survey. So we are seeing this issue just changing acceptability among our youth, and they're thinking of not being at risk in engaging in these behaviors. True or false, young people who hang out with friends who use are at more risk to use substances even if they come from a well-managed family system. Who believes that's true? Okay, about half. Actually, the research shows, and probably prevention is the most researched part of addiction. Probably about 40 years of prevention research is done, and the leaders in that were Hawkins and Catalina Lano from Washington State. The top 2 risk factors is peers who use and the availability of access and alcohol and substances to those youth. Those are the 2 risk factors. So I really focus on this with my family group that I do on Wednesday night for families who have someone with addiction in their life. It's a support group because they come in feeling so much guilt and so much feeling like they caused this somehow. And we try to help them understand the progression of this disease in their loved one because the choices are happening at age 12 to 15 in most cases. And this disease is a progressive chronic disease. And when you add substances to a young developing brain, you are now impacting the trajectory of that brain and how it's progressing in its development. Here are some data that I wanted to expose you to around the opioid crisis. If you haven't read a newspaper, or you probably, if you have read it, you've heard about this issue. We have a statewide national state declaration of a crisis, an emergency crisis by our governor. Since '99, prescribing of opiates has quadrupled. In the United States, we hold about 3 to 4% of the population, but we consume 95% of the opiates that are being marketed, that are being produced right now. So 3% of the population, 95% are being used within the United States. Since '99 to 2015, same time period, guess what? Opioid overdoses have increased, they've quadrupled. 6 out of 10 overdoses involve opioids. And since 2000, over 500,000 people have died from an opioid overdose. The biggest statistic, though, that impacted me, because we just started getting this data, we just started with a prescription drug monitoring program in August of 2017, where all controlled substances, 2 through 5, which pain medications come in under that, had to be placed into it at the time of being dispensed. It completely shut down doctor shopping because pharmacists could now see if that prescription was just filled somewhere else. It's real-time data. But the number, we got some local Blair County data of this chart from like January of 2017 through July of 2018. It showed a trend line of opioids of just 2 of them, 2 pain medications, hydrocodone and OxyContin. Over 500,000 pills are being dispensed monthly. This is monthly in Blair County. Just 2 pain medications. That doesn't count all the others that are being prescribed. The biggest concern of when I looked at this data was this next chart. That orange area, 45 to 70, that's who's receiving most of these medications. Now you see them trickling down to other age groups, but that's where the volume of these opioids are being dispensed. So there's a concern for dependency on these medications because these are highly dependent medications for that age group, but also diversion and at risk of being targeted because they have these medications on them. So those are some of the things that we are looking at. Here is our overdose data for Pennsylvania. 13 people a day in Pennsylvania are dying from this disease, from an overdose death. Here in Blair County, I took this position in '97, and at that time we had about 9 overdoses a year. In 2000, the number jumped to 21. That's when OxyContin hit the streets. From that point forward, we've lost anywhere from 21 to 28 people. I think it was the highest it went until about 2015. At that point, there was a lot of pressure. Remember, this is not a new issue. If you're just hearing about it in the last couple years, it's because the death rate has gotten to a point where we can't ignore this anymore. Not that we should have been. This should have been a crisis in 2000 when we saw the death rate starting to go up. But what happened was prescribing practice was starting, people were being removed from pain medication but still in active withdrawal, so they moved to the street, they started using heroin, and this is across the age range. But what was happening in 2015 is that the supply of heroin was being cut with fentanyl. And this is not your pharmaceutical grade fentanyl, this was being produced in China, coming through the Mexican border, through the supply chain, cut there and into the distribution chain. And we saw death rates go through. These are families in our community. Think about it. Over 21 to 25 people even say, average, since 2000 have lost a loved one in their family to this disease. They are hurting in our community. 52 last. That's good. Heroin is just a small part of what we have here. We have a nation that has a substance abuse problem. We are using substances at a high level, and it's impacting our communities, our families. So Pathway of Hope stands on the foundation that addiction is a disease similar to other chronic diseases. It has a progression. A lot of times I hear in this, I hear some really harsh statements about let them die. I hear they chose this. But if we want to really understand, we need to understand addiction and what it's about. There's a lot of people that are just angry. They want them to stop. Family members that are just frustrated. They want them to stop, and they don't understand. We need to make sure they get the information so they know how to love their loved one differently. There's a lot going on with this disease. It hijacks the brain. Most people stand back and say, I can't understand how they'll let their family fall apart because of this, because the brain has been hijacked. No, I'm not making excuses for them, and I believe consequences are important around this disease because it helps the trajectory of that person to move, maybe to get help. So, addiction has a spiritual remedy, and that's what faith communities can be a big part of because these souls are broken. People in active addiction are separated from God. Their spirits are broken, and they don't know how to remend them. They don't know how to get there, and that's where we can come in. But this ministry is not just about the recovery supports. It's about from prevention, like Pastor John said, from prevention to helping families find resources when they need it, and also then helping the individual recover from this. So, and it's to provide a safe place where we can talk about this, because we have people in our pews that have this going on in their life right now. This is going on. And they need to know that it's okay, that this church is a community where they can find the support and fellowship to support them during this walk. This is not only professionally a very important issue to me, of course, but it's a personal passion of mine. One of the other hats that I didn't tell you that I wear is that I am also a person in long-term recovery. In fact, this past Wednesday, I just celebrated 31 years in recovery. Thank you. And it's all him. I can tell you it was all him. I was those statistics. 8th grade is the initiation substance with me. And I can give you all kinds of reasons to justify why I started as a young girl. But that's not what it was about. There may not be a reason. Maybe it's just their peer group is using and they are curious and they experiment. Whatever, for me, there was some issues going on in my life, but all I know is when I used that substance for the first time, it hit a hole in me that I didn't even know I had. And it responded differently to me. And my trajectory in that disease started at that moment. I went from a ninth grade college-bound A student to barely graduating college, or not college, I'm sorry, high school with a general education. I did not thrive because of my disease. I barely made it through. The best thing I did for my mom was when I was 19, I left home and went 3,000 miles away. Along that journey, and I went to church. I came from a two-parent home and went to church every day, but I did not have a relationship with God at that time. I knew about him, but I knew him as a fear-type God, and I didn't feel I could ever live up to be able to have a relationship with him. Never had a Bible. And I actually tell a story when the Gideons come and talk about the Bibles in the hotel. I was one of those people. I ended up at a hotel drinking and saw the Bible and took it when I left and started reading it from that point forward. And that God had been pursuing me, though, the whole time. God had been pursuing me in my brokenness even before I started using substances. And he pursued me. But I still was out there for another almost 9 years in my addiction. At that point, I landed at, and again, my mother prayed every day for me. I know she did. She did novenas every day. And during that time, as I was reading the Bible, because I didn't understand it. I was reading it, but I didn't understand what this was about. I didn't have the mentorship that I needed. And when what happened was that I landed in an inpatient program at Cove Forge, not as a patient, but as a secretary. God has a funny way of making sure our path gets where it needs to be. And so within a couple months of sitting there, I ended up on the admissions office talking to other people about why they needed to get help for their problem. Talk about God and his ways. He was convicting me every day. I couldn't do it. I just couldn't continue to ignore the issue that I had with myself. So at that point, I went through a weekend program, and that was when I stopped using substances. But that was just the beginning. My recovery process, and it's one that I manage every day to keep it strong, because I know my disease is still there. My brain still talks to me, but it's because I have a strong recovery foundation now. But I don't ignore it. I have to keep it healthy. But at that point, I didn't have a support system. So I had to, I started back to the church that I was raised in, but I just didn't have that mentorship. And a friend invited me to a Methodist church in Altoona. Started there in a Sunday school class. Stayed there for about a year, and then we moved to Hollidaysburg, my husband and I started here at his home church. This is the church he was raised in. And I walked into the Searchers Sunday school class. I see a couple of them standing here. They didn't know I was in early recovery. But what they offered me was the mentorship, the experience and hope of how to have a relationship with Christ. And they showed me it was okay to struggle with your faith. And it was okay to, thank you. I see a couple sitting over here. And I want to thank those that are in the audience today, because in the pews, I needed that. I needed that mentorship. I needed that fellowship. I had to walk away from a lifestyle. I had to rebuild that community around me, and they did that for me. They invited us to game nights. They gave us things to do, my husband and I, that could be a safe place for me to build that recovery. I was so blessed to have walked into that room because they just wrapped their arms around me. So I know, personally, I know the church can do this. You can do this as a church family. We have a God-made place for people to come and find that they are welcome and that they can learn how to have that relationship. So I thank you for that. I thank you personally, and I ask you that if you have this issue going on, please come up and talk to one of us in the team. That if you need help, we want to help you. But also, if you feel that this is something that you would be interested in doing, I hope that you will join us in this ministry. And thank you for letting me share today.
Lord, I pray that the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable and pleasing to you. Amen. Addict, junkie, those people. These are some words that we use, that stereotype people in addiction. And as people, we tend to have those stereotypes, and we have judgments, and we sometimes have them without even realizing it, that we don't realize that we're doing it. It's just there. And I have a personal story. I'm going to share a few, but a personal story of where I realized that I was making a judgment without even knowing it. When I was in college, I lost my license for a few months because of a medical issue. They thought I was having seizures again. Praise the Lord, I was not. So, first of all, Hollidaysburg's bus system is horrendous. Roaring Springs is worse. They don't even have one. So I walked up to the bus station in Hollidaysburg in front of the courthouse, and I sat down, and I could feel the judgment that I had given whenever I passed by in a car of, oh, there's someone sitting on the bench in front of the courthouse waiting for a bus, wonder what they did, wonder what they were for. And I didn't even realize I was doing it, but I sat there and I could feel that. I could feel that from people walking by, I could feel it from people driving by, and I was like, oh darn. So I got to change this. I didn't know I was doing this, but this got to change. So that's one humbling experience that I had with my own defects, and realizing, Sarah, you got to stop. You got to get it together, girlfriend. I worked here when I was in high school, and 2 years while I was in college, I was an intern, and so thankful for that. I worked in youth ministries, and then God called me kind of away. I left. I was in college, finished up college, and then after I graduated, did my internship with Blair County Drug and Alcohol Partnerships, and God was calling me kind of out of the church ministry into the drug and alcohol mental health world. And so I did groups in prison. I did a whole bunch in my internship. But then I ended up, my first job was at Cove Forge, Drug and Alcohol Inpatient Center, where I was a counselor. And I tell you, I learned a lot of life lessons there. God used that to equip me for a lot of things that I was going to face in our one program that we run here that I'll talk about in a minute. But one thing I definitely learned, and it was kind of reinforced, was addiction doesn't discriminate. When we think of addiction, we think of the homeless person sitting under the bridge with a needle in their arm. And that's maybe a face that it takes. But when I was in there counseling, I had people sit across from me that were doctors, they were lawyers, they were CEOs, they were fry cooks at McDonald's, they were homeless people, they were young, they were old, they have different beliefs, a lot of them Christians. Addiction does not discriminate. Addiction doesn't care who you are. Addiction doesn't care what your job is. Addiction doesn't care what your beliefs are, how much money you have, what kind of family you come from, your age. It doesn't care. It doesn't discriminate. Anybody can be affected by it, and anybody's family can be affected by it. And I think that's a stereotype that, that there are those people that we gotta break. and that stigma that we have to, as a church, kind of wipe away and be like, be a place where people within our pews and in the community know that at this church, in this faith family, in this congregation, you can come in your brokenness and you can take off your mask of, oh, I have it all together. You can take that mask off and know that you will be embraced by love and hope by those of us around you. That people in our own congregation that are sitting there feeling alone and isolated because they don't think they can talk about it or don't want to know what to do, can realize that God's not judging you, and neither are we. The same grace God is giving you is what we're giving you, and we're here to love. There was a quote when we went to the training that the trainer said, and I think it's beautiful, it's in a congregation with the peoples in the pew, if pain could make a sound, would you still be able to hear the sermon? If the pain of the people in the pews could make a sound, would you still be able to hear the sermon? Let's think about that. So I want to kind of segue real quick into I'm back here working again with Brandy Burkett, we lead the youth ministries program, and we have a program called Drop-Ins. It's the after-school program, and 1 day a week. And a lot of the kids we get are not from a church background. A lot of them would be considered high risk. A lot of them, to come in, you'd be like, oh my gosh. We call them our diamonds. A lot of them are diamonds in the very rough. And if you came in, you'd be like, oh my gosh. And it used to be a program that I was like, that it was honestly one of my least favorite, but now it is my favorite. Like, these kids are awesome. I've gotten to hear their stories, and their stories are heartbreaking. But what's heartbreaking is they consider themselves the bad kids. And they voice that, yeah, we're the bad kids. And they get that message from society, from school, from everywhere. We're the bad kids. And they've gotten it so much that they own it. And they're like, well, that's what we are. That's what we are. And so Brandy and I all the time get to sit with them and be like, you're not a bad kid. You're not a bad person. You've made some bad choices, but you're not a bad person. And I don't want you to think it's just the after-school diamonds in the rough kids that, are using and things like that and affected by addiction. It's kids within our church, too, that we've sat with, that they've become vulnerable with us, and that they've shared with Brandy and I, I'm using, or I'm being affected by this. My friends using, my parents using. So it doesn't matter whether you're high risk or you're churched all your life. Like, it can affect anyone. And, we have the privilege of being able to help them and get them help if they want it. But I guess what I'm going to end with, so that I don't run you over in time, is a quote. And it is, you will never look into the eyes of someone that God does not love. So be kind. You will never look into the eyes of someone that God does not love. So be kind. Thank you.